Did you ever have a question, does God really care about me? Does he even know me? Well, to answer those questions, I want you to turn to the beautiful words in 1 Peter. You are God's personal concern. You are God's personal concern. I'm going to tell you a very personal story tonight, a Taylor family story. I lived through it, my brothers and sister lived through it, my parents lived through it. And while I'm telling you a story of long ago in China, I want you to think about a powerful question. How do you anchor children for whatever's going to come? Because my story will be a story of war, and children living in a country where war was tearing up everybody's lives, including ours. And our parents were anchoring us for whatever would come in a war. But how do you anchor children today for whatever will come? And I think you'll find answers in the story that I tell you tonight. But before I tell you the story, let me make one important observation. One of God's greatest ways of revealing himself is through the testimony and example of God's children when they are struggling with pain and suffering and trouble. Everybody in China knew there was going to be a war. My father and mother were missionaries there. I was born in China. In fact, the year that I was born, the Japanese had invaded China and started gobbling chunk after chunk after chunk to be part of the Japanese empire. But you know, it wasn't going to be our war. My mother was American, my father was British. They were missionaries serving God. But we would see the gunboats out in the harbor with the Japanese gunboat shooting up into the Chinese guerrillas in the hills beyond our house. And we would see in the morning the Chinese guerrillas bloodied, bandaged, limping around Mule Road where they were escaping from where they had been attacked the night before by the Japanese. And my mother asked this question: how do you anchor children for whatever comes? Well, you know, my mother was from around Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and she was a school teacher, and she said, I know how you anchor children. You anchor children with the promises of God. And she said, the way you make them really remember is by singing. So my mother said, I will put the words of God's promises to music, and the children will sing them. So every morning the little Taylor choir would gather around the old pump organ. We had a ritual at our house of family worship after breakfast. And Mother would play the old pump organ, and she put the words of Psalm 91 to music, this beautiful, beautiful psalm of the promises of God. The beginning words of Psalm 91 use 4 names of God, the beginning words. The first name of God, the Most High God, above everyone God. The second name of God, the Almighty, not the Almighty in strength, but the Almighty that cares and provides for you. The third name of God, the Almighty, unchangeable covenant God from the beginning to the end, yesterday, today, and forever. He is the God. And the last name of God in Psalm 91. The creator of heaven and earth God. That's who says, you are my personal concern. So we sang this beautiful psalm, and we would come to these words in Psalm 91, and he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you. My parents left us in the school for the children of missionaries' children to be educated and return to their missionary work in far northwest China. The day after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Japanese appeared on the doorstep of our school. They brought a Shinto priest out to the ballpark, conducted a ceremony that said this school now belonged to the great emperor of Japan. And they came in with pieces of paper with Japanese writing, on the furniture, the desks, the chairs, the tables, the pianos, the beds. Everything now belonged to the great emperor of Japan. And then they put the seals on us and we had to wear an armband. At first they just left it that way. But after a while they looked at this beautiful school that had been founded by my great-grandfather, Hudson Taylor, and they said, we want to make this into a military base. And that was when they marched us into concentration camp. I will never forget that day. Up at the head of the line, the headmaster with a long snaking line of the children of missionaries, God's servants, the children of God's servants, being marched into concentration camp like criminals. And the headmaster began to sing, God is our refuge and strength, therefore we will not be afraid. We had learned this hymn. And we sang with him, God is our refuge and strength, therefore we will not be afraid. You will recognize it as Psalm 46. We ended up in a concentration camp in Shandong province called Weixian. I remember when we arrived there, we were not welcomed. The place was already packed with about 1,500 prisoners, and now a whole school of the missionaries' children were being marched into this place. But I need to pause the story to take you to my mother and my father, because warring armies separated us now with no way to get together. My mother has told the story 100 times. She said we were having a faculty meeting at the Bible school in far northwest China where we had escaped in front of the Japanese. And she said as we were having the faculty meeting, somebody pushed the door open and said, Mrs. Taylor, America is at war, and told the story of Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. My mother said my heart froze. All I could think about, the Japanese now had my beautiful children. She said all I could think about was my children in the hands of the Japanese armies. And I should mention to you one of the first demands that the Japanese made, that the teenage girls should be available as comfort women to the Japanese soldiers. And my mother said I got up from that faculty meeting and rushed to my bedroom and fell on the bed and just wept in terror at what the Japanese were going to do to my children. And she said as I wept and sobbed, imagining, would they take Kathleen in that way? Would they take Jamie and make him cannon fodder in front of the Japanese guns? She said, I heard a voice, and I knew whose voice it was. She said, when I was a teenager and gave my heart to God in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, we had a pastor, we called him Pa Ferguson. And Pa Ferguson had a wonderful way of putting Bible words to music, to children's language so they could understand. And she said, I heard his voice. Alice, my mother's name. Alice, if you look after the things that are dear to God, He will look after the things that are dear to you. Now, you know what verse that is in the Bible? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And who were the children? Who were the things that were dear to God? Well, she said, the Chinese. I had heard God call me to China to serve him there. And I was to take care of the things that were dear to God, the Chinese people. And who was dear to me? Kathleen, Jamie, Mary, Johnny. She said it was like the hand of God wiped the terror out of her heart, the tears off her face, and it was like she realized that she had a pact with God, a covenant, that if I looked after the things that were dear to God, God would look after the things that were dear to me. Now let me put this story in context. We would not see our parents for 5.5 years. You fathers and mothers try to imagine it. 5.5 years. Back in the concentration camp, we had guard dogs and bayonet drills and electrified wires and prisoner numbers, all the things that would make children terrified. But the teachers, our Christian missionary teachers that were there as substitute parents said, you will become our gifts to God. We will anchor you. They said, School will go on. You said in a concentration camp, school will go on. So school went on even though we didn't have proper books, we didn't have proper equipment, but school went on. Even you were sitting on the floor or out under the trees, school would go on. They said nice manners will go on. Nice manners in a concentration camp? You could be marching with an empty tin can down or a soap dish or a tin can to get boiled animal grain, and that was to be what you were to eat from. Nice manners would go on. And Miss Stark would come up, Mary Taylor, put your back up straight. Do not slouch over your food while you eat. Do not talk while you have food in your mouth. And they would preach good manners. People began to lose enormous amounts of weight because there was not enough food. People that had black marketed over the wall and were risking their lives to trade anything they had for food would have eggshells. They said, if you've swapped eggs, save the eggshells for the children. And they would grind up the eggshells, and our teachers would line us up and put spoonfuls of powdered eggshells on our tongue, because the doctors in the camp, prisoner doctors, knew that eggshells were good for calcium, for bones, and for teeth. There was a group of people in the camp, the Salvation Army, that had been imprisoned with us, and the Salvation Army said, we're going to get out of this place. We will win the war. Oh, the Salvation Army had guts. They said, we will win the war, and when we win the war, we have to have a victory medley, that we will play the victory medley for when whoever rescues us. Well, who was that going to be? It didn't seem like we would ever be rescued from this place. And as we went about, Tuesday night was the time. The Salvation Army would practice what they said was going to be a victory medley to celebrate whoever rescued us, even though it didn't look like anything was going to rescue us. Remember, we had the words of Psalm 91 playing in our hearts. He shall give his angels charge over you to keep you. He shall give his angels charge over you to keep you. Just like the old-fashioned gramophone needle sticking in the record, he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you. And the Salvation Army band put together the victory medley. It was said, well, we don't know, it might be America, it might be England, it might be China, it might be Russia that rescues us. So they put the four national anthems together with things like Happy Days Are Here Again to sing for when the Japanese were defeated and whoever came to rescue us. I can remember people were getting fearful with lack of hope. We had been there now almost 3 years in this Japanese concentration camp. And as we were there, hope disappeared. People wondered if they would ever get out of this place alive. There were grown men that had lost as much as 100 pounds in this camp. I remember there was one hero in the camp that we loved. We called him Uncle Eric. Some of you may have seen the movie Chariots of Fire about the hero Eric Liddell, who won the Olympic gold medal in the 1924 Olympics. But remember, he was a Christian and would not run on Sunday. Eric Liddell became a missionary to China. He died in our concentration camp. But before he did, he used to preach and teach from the Sermon on the Mount. That was his favorite passage. His favorite passage was, and he would say, Jesus taught you to love your enemies. And that means love the Japanese. How could you say that? Some of the boys said. Uncle Eric, that's just probably sort of something to aim for. He said, well, that's what I used to think until I read the verse after that says, pray for your enemies. And he said, now I am praying for the Japanese. One of our classmates was so profoundly moved by the message of Eric Liddell in that camp that he gave his life to God to serve as a missionary throughout his lifetime to Japan. I can remember August 1945. People were now puny with hunger. The teachers had given us a few days off from school. I was lying sick on the steamer trunks. You could not sleep on the floor. There were no beds. You don't carry beds to a concentration camp. And I was lying on the steamer trunks in the early morning of August 17, 1945, feeling sick with an upset stomach. I thought I heard an airplane. I knew it couldn't be an airplane. Airplanes didn't come over this part of China. it got louder and louder, and I jumped to the window of the barracks and looked out, and here was an American B-24 bomber flying so low, about 400 feet over the treetops, it looked like you could almost reach up to touch it. And as I watched, people began dropping by parachute out into the fields beyond the barrier walls. Well, it was instant cure for my diarrhea. I jumped up from the steamer trunks and ran for the gates of the camp. I figured out of 1,500 prisoners, I was going to be the first person at the gate to welcome whoever these gods, these angels that were falling from the sky. 6 Americans and a Chinese interpreter with them, parachuting down into the fields beyond the concentration camp. Wei Xian went mad. They were hysterical with joy. People were hysterical, weeping, pounding, dancing, cursing. Men just pushed out of the gates of the camp into the fields to pick up these American gods, to carry them on their shoulders. The name of the airplane was the Armored Angel. The Armored Angel. The men of the camp carried these American gods back on bony platforms of shoulders to the gates of the camp. When they got to the gates, the Salvation Army band was on a mound by the gate playing the victory medley. And when they got to that place, oh, say, does that star-spangled banner still wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave? The young American major who led this victory mission, the liberation mission, just slithered down to a standing salute. And a young American teenager, a trombonist in the Salvation Army, crumpled down to the ground and began to weep. He knew that we were free. The Americans took charge of that camp and began arranging the liberation of the camp. I will remember, they evacuated us, the 4 Taylor children, in a huge transport airplane on 9/10/1945. I can remember the 4 of us in that plane. My father had not even told our mother he was making arrangements. He said, now if I tell my wife that I'm trying to get the children evacuated from the camp and brought back to the far, far, far inner sections of North China, he said, and if it all falls about, she will just be so sorrowful and just not be able to stand it. So he had behind the scenes been connecting with the Americans for the evacuation of the Taylor children. We started in a mule cart on that morning of 9/11. We stayed overnight in an Office of Strategic Service American base, and then they put us in charge of a Chinese Christian friend of our parents. What a story. Through the fields, through the rain, through the mud, starting out on a springless wooden horse cart with wooden wheels through the mud. When we got to the first hills, the mule cart stopped and said, we cannot go any further. It's too heavy a weight. So we children said, we'll get out and run. We had never been in this part of China before. We were carrying our shoes. We didn't know if we'd ever see shoes again. And as we ran, Kathleen would wave into the fields and speak into Chinese. And he said, how many more miles is it to Fengxiang? Because we at least knew the name of the town where our parents lived. And we were all alone, running down through the wood, through the mud, through the dirt, through the rain. Finally, Johnny got so sick and so weak that he could not walk, and Jamie and Kathleen were piggybacking him till we finally caught up to another Chinese mule cart driver. And Kathleen said, would you let my little brother sit on the mule cart? You want to hear another night of miracles? In the darkness, the man looked at us and he said, I know your parents. He said he knew where the gospel mission was. And he began driving us toward the city gate. And as we got to the outside city gate, arriving at Fengxiang, walled city with giant mud walls, gates closed at dark to keep out wolves and bandits. That night of miracles, the gates were open. And we went on in the darkness, no lights, no electricity in this part of China. Finally, the mule cart driver stopped and he said, my mule has had no food today, I must stop. He says, up the street is the gospel mission. No lights, in the darkness. There was nothing for us to see where we were. Kathleen approached the first Chinese man she could see in the darkness, and she said, "Mister, could you please take us to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor of the mission?" He must have looked at her and thought she was a woman of the street, because no good woman would be on the streets at that time of night in China. And he quickly walked away. The second man she approached, she said, "Mister, could you please take us to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor of the Gospel Mission?" The Chinese man looked and saw 4 white children. He was a student of the Bible school where my father and mother were teaching. He immediately knew we were the 4 Taylor children he had been praying for during the war. He said, "Follow me." He brought us through a moon gate. I looked through and saw through the candlelight my dad and mom. I had not seen them for 5.5 years. And I began to scream, "Daddy, Mommy!" And the man took us in through the front door of the room, and he said, "Mrs. Taylor, the children have arrived." And she said, "Whose children?" We just poured into her arms. She was so astonished she had to measure us to see who was who. To our disbelief, we found we had a little brother almost 5 years old that we had never seen before. My mother told us this story so many, many times. I always thought she left something out. Did she hear a voice that night when she took us in her arms? Did she hear a voice say, "Alice, you looked after the things that were dear to God, and I looked after the things that were dear to you"?